Okay, we are live.
Welcome to the Mentionables Live. So tonight we are back for a part 2 of an extremely long but extremely interesting conversation we had a couple weeks ago on Joel Furches' research. Speaking of Joel Furches, you will see right over here, this direction,
Joel Furches,
the one and only. Down here right underneath me, the terror that flaps in the night, otherwise known as
Clinton Wilcox, or Darkwing Duck if you're as old as I am.
And nope, not that way. That wow, it's hard to point diagonally in the mirror. Right down here, we have.
I'm Steve. Just Steve.
Just Steve. Welcome, Just Steve. We're glad to have you back with us again. It was good having you last time, and we're glad to have you back.
Excited to be here.
All right. So I don't know if this is like, we're supposed to do this like a church service where we have announcements. Sometimes we have announcements. Sometimes we don't have announcements. I'm not sure if we actually need to go through that or if I'm just wasting time while I can get ready for our next segment. But does anybody have any announcements?
Nothing I can think of.
Thanks for helping me kill the dead air there. That's
I don't have any.
Right.
Well, this doesn't really affect any of our listeners or anything, but I may be homeschooling my nieces starting next year.
Oh, congratulations!
So, yeah. Well,
for switching sides, the work that I do for the research on deconversion, I recently created a video which is available on the Facebook page for Switching Sides, where I reviewed various signs that you might be deconverting, wherein I was debunking signs. Anyway.
So this was not, the classical Mr. Atheist, 7 signs you might be an atheist soon that we responded to, right?
Actually, it's that exact video, but I responded to it out of the research that I've done. More so than just apologetically. I was looking at it from a research standpoint.
Well, I'll have to check that out as well then.
Yep.
Yeah, I suppose I can make an announcement that would be relevant to the listeners. I was sent a book, Contenders by Mark Newman. So far, it's very, very good. And I'm only on chapter 3, but I was sent this book for free so that I could write up a review for it on Goodreads and Amazon and the LTI website and, various other ones. And so, I'll be writing it up just as soon as I get it finished. But, I know Mark personally. And so, just based on what I know from Mark, I can say that the book is definitely worth reading, but also the content so far is excellent. I don't expect that to change, from here to the end. So that's a book that I definitely want to support. And if anyone here is watching and would like to pick it up, I would encourage them to do so. It's basically a book that's geared toward the church, but it talks about the abortion issue and how pro-life people will be able to positively affect our culture for life, essentially. And so it looks at the various reasons why people don't speak out about the topic, and just kind of examines those, and in light of what why it's so important that we speak out and that kind of thing. And I'll be able to give a more synopsis as soon as I read it and write up a review.
Not many people know this, Clinton, but I could have been a contender.
That's exactly what I was thinking when as soon as the book came in and I was holding it in my hands. I could have been a contender. Yeah.
Well, speaking about contenders, you just we ran Steve off, so Just Steve is gone at this point. we can
Shram
only assume.
Shram has scrammed.
That's true. That's true. So we can assume he will return. But if that is all in the way announcements, then I am going to go ahead and play this.
Love song, worship song.
Is it a love song? Is it a worship song?
It even comes with the jingle.
That it does, and Steve is back with us.
All right, so for Steve's sake, I'm going to explain the rules of this particular game, and for the listeners as well. Love Song, Worship Song is a game we play where I read, and then each of the mentionables here in the show is going to try to guess whether the song I'm reading is a love song in a kind of poppy song that you sing to a girl or guy, or is it a worship song, like something you would sing to God.
Okay, that sounds fun.
All right. Is everyone ready?
Let's go.
And just so you're not feeling the pressure, Steve, we haven't actually been keeping score. So
Oh, thank goodness. This will be interesting.
All right, so lyrics to song number 1. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. You opened my eyes to your wonders anew. You captured my heart with this love, because nothing on earth is as beautiful as you.
Yeah, that's a worship song all day long.
It's definitely a worship song.
You know, just for the sake, they sound really confident. I'm going to say love song.
All right. So we've got worship song, and love song. Okay, this one was Beautiful One by Tim Hughes, and that is indeed a worship song.
Yeah, we actually do this one at my church.
Well, since you're going to actually recognize, maybe you should sit this one out and just tell everybody what it was at the end.
All right. Yeah,
okay.
I mean, I was actually going to do that one last, but then Steve chimed in and he was really confident. So I'm thinking, oh, maybe he knows that one too. So I'll just throw mine out. Okay. So.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
All right. The second lyrics. In the secret, in the quiet place, in the stillness, you are there. In the secret, in the quiet hour, I wait. Only for you. I want to know you more. I want to know you. I want to hear your voice. I want to know you more. I want to touch you. I want to see your face. I want to know you more.
That's a tough one. I'm going love song on that one, though.
Love song.
This one is most definitely a worship song. I don't remember who
Recognize
wrote it. And yeah, Andy Park, I want to say, wrote it, but Sonic Flood was the band that actually made it popular.
Huh.
Yep. In the Secret, written by Andy Park.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's a worship song.
What?
Whoa. That's intense.
This one,
I was very confident.
Yeah, that one is actually one of the when you hear someone like write about how they hate these modern, like, God is my girlfriend songs. That's usually the kind of the stock example that those people will point to.
That does not surprise me a bit.
That literally sounded like some pop song I was vaguely familiar with. Like I thought for sure those were the lyrics.
Yeah, it's not a Britney Spears song.
Showing your age there, aren't you?
Well, my brother was heavily into Britney Spears for obvious reasons. But
Spears,
I'm a classically trained musician, and actually knowing music has really killed any enjoyment I could get out of pop singers.
Hey, just hit me one more time, okay?
Oops, you did it again.
We share that in common.
All right. I got another one here. Everybody ready for it?
Yep.
All right. I just want you close. Where you can be sure that it'll get better. You and me together through the days and nights. I don't worry because Everything's going to be all right. No one, no one, no one can get in the way of what I feel for you. You can get in the way of what I feel for you. When the rain is pouring down and my heart is hurting, you will always be around. This I know for certain.
I'm going love song. I feel like I'm going first a lot here, but I'm going love song on that one.
Okay.
I feel committed to love song at this. I'm going
All right.
love song as well.
I actually do not know this song, so this will be a guess.
Okay.
I'm going to say love song, primarily because the first two were worship songs. So I'm going by the law of averages here, and assuming that this will be a love song.
You know, sometimes I do shows where they're like all pop songs or all worship songs. So.
Oh well, yeah, it's kind of like, man, these answers are all C. I think I probably have some of these wrong. You know?
Yeah, no, I do that on purpose. I'm a teacher. I've been trained how to design tests.
Okay.
Anyway, in this case, the song is "No One" by Alicia Keys, and if you recognize that name, love song. Congratulations.
Yeah, yeah, she's a good piano player, but I just never really listened to her music.
Okay, everybody ready for the next one?
No.
Let's go.
Okay, we got two more.
All right.
So the next one goes like this. Here you are next to me, so much beauty at my feet. All I want to do is swim, but the waves keep crashing in. No, I'm not afraid to get out. Take me down. I'm so tired of the shore. Let me in. You're an ocean, beautiful and blue. I want to swim in you.
I don't know this one either, so this will be another guess.
Okay.
I'm going worship song.
Okay.
I'm going to say worship song too.
Reluctantly.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to go love song because I'm committed to love song now.
Right.
All right. Okay. The song is Ocean by Lady Antebellum.
Oh.
And that is indeed a love song. Good job, Caleb.
Yep, Caleb got
You know,
that one.
I figure as long as you mixed it up, I've got to get some right. So.
Oh, wait, but actually you got the name wrong. They're going woke now, so it's Lady A.
Oh, right. Yeah, I apologize to
Yeah, you
everyone
can't
whom
say
I
that
just
word
offended.
That's right.
But oops, I said it again.
You got to stop being racist. Though.
I mean, oops, I did it again since we're going with the theme here.
Yeah.
Are they really?
All
Like,
right.
that is true story. Are they really going by Lady A now?
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're so toxic, Joel.
Yeah, it's true. I can't help it. I was born this way.
We're going to have to remove it.
Right.
Cancel Joel.
Cancel Joel. Hashtag
I've got a
cancel Joel.
story about that. That actually, in the college that I'm attending now as I pursue my PhD, I come into class and the cohort that I'm with is consisted of people from like India and the Middle East and Africa and anyway, you get the idea. These
Right.
there may be one or two. I like the scrolling text that you got down there. Thank you.
Yeah. You forgot
There
the
might be-
hashtag, though.
There might be one or two in the class that are like from inner city Baltimore, and then there's a white girl, and then there's me. And so our African lesbian professor gets up and just makes a sweeping comment towards the entire class about how much, integration and diversity. Turns and she looks at me and she says, "Sorry, Joel." To which I respond, "I was born this way."
Right.
And that's not untrue. I can't help it.
That's a pretty relevant interaction right there.
Yeah.
Everybody laughed because I was joking, but not really.
Right.
All right,
so,
last
so
song.
So black woman and lesbian. She checks 3 of the woke boxes.
She's also an immigrant.
You cut out there. What was that?
I said she's also an immigrant because she's from Africa.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, last song. Here are the lyrics. Here I am once again. I pour out my heart, for I know that you hear every cry. You are listening, no matter what state my heart is in. You are faithful to answer with words that are true and hope that is real. As I feel your touch to all that's within, in the safety of this place, I'm longing to pour out my heart that I love you, pour out my heart to say that I need you, pour out my heart to say that I'm thankful, pour out my heart to say that you're wonderful. The end.
No matter what state my heart is in, be it California, Arizona, Utah. I actually don't know this one either.
Okay.
See, I'm biased now because I really want to say a worship song, but you said "Here I am once again," and now I've just got Behind These Hazel Eyes. Just like immediately I heard that, and so now I'm the Kelly Clarkson's on the brain. I think I'm going worship song.
Okay.
Your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah. I think I'm also going to go worship song, just because some of the imagery sounds more worship songy. I don't know any love songs that talk about, like, well, I don't know. Yeah, it's a guess again. Like I said, I don't know the song.
All right.
Yeah, I should probably go love song. Yeah, I should probably go love song, just because as a worship leader, it's my job to know worship music, and I don't recognize it. But I'm gonna say worship song.
I'm glad that I managed to get one or two that you didn't know.
Yeah. Well, 3 that I didn't know, but the first one was a guess based on the law of averages. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
I really, really want to say worship song, but I'm really committed to this strategy of love song at this point. So I'm going to go love song. Yeah.
All right. That song was "Pour Out My Heart" by Craig Massot, which was a worship song.
Oh, I haven't even heard of that worship singer.
Well, I probably butchered his last name, but
yeah, I don't know. I can't think of any Craigs off the top of my head either. Anyway, in worship music, so yeah,
just the one sandwiched in between Phillips and Dean.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Phillips, Craig, and Dean, right?
Right there you go. All right, and that was Love Song, Worship Song. Thanks for playing. All right. I didn't keep score, so I can't tell you how you did.
I feel I'm looking for one of those like machines where like the cash, like you get sticky or whatever, and the cash is like supposed to stick to your body however much you can grab. Like we should at least get the opportunity to head into one of those, right?
Agreed.
Oh, yeah.
Yep, the apologetics cash grab or something.
That's right.
Very consistent with apologetics.
Yes, of course.
All right. Well, with that, I am going to disappear for a few minutes and turn it over to you, Joel, as you recap a little bit from part one. And I'll be back in a little bit, but I'm turning the reins over to you.
Okay. So this is part 2 of a series of shows that we're doing, presenting my research that I've been doing for 3 years on the subject of religious deconversion. Religious deconversion meaning that the person moves from identifying as a Christian to identifying as an atheist. Now, I use the terms identifying because I had this asked by one of my followers recently, who asked, well, what am I using to define atheism? The problem is, in order to gather this kind of data, I have to go with the data that's available. I don't have the kind of budget to go in and pull random samplings of individuals and mail out surveys or create things. So I have to go with viewing version stories that are available through YouTube, podcasts, blogs, that kind of thing. And so in order, in those deconversion stories, the only thing that I know is that the person tells me they were once Christian and tells me they are now atheist. So the only things that I'm using to define Christian atheism are a matter of self-identity. I identified as Christian, now I identify as atheist. The question my research is asking is, how do you transition from saying publicly presenting yourself as a Christian to publicly presenting yourself as an atheist. So I shared my 5-stage model last time, and I'll review that now. But before I do, Steve or Clinton, did you want to say anything about my method?
No, I'm good. I'm just excited to get into the review and see where the conversation goes from here. I'm good on comprehension stuff.
Good.
Yeah, I don't think I really have anything to add or need any clarification on or anything.
Okay, great. So, yeah, guys, tell me if I cut out or audio is acting her up so that I can repeat myself, because obviously I don't hear it when it happens.
Will do.
Okay, thanks. Anyways, so my 5-stage model, the first called setting conditions. Now, what I mean by setting conditions is I'm talking about the background from which a deconvert comes. What kind of background, options, or what I've called modes, do they share? And in the last episode, I talked about them coming from what I've started to call a modal typical church. When I say modal typical, there are particular modes of religious operation that I've identified that are common in the background of deconverts. And so the more modes of operation that a church has, the more modal typical it is, if that makes sense.
Are you going to cover some of those modes?
Yeah, I'd like to come in on that at the end of the show. I'll just throw a couple out here since this is a review. Although I'd love to hear Clinton come in on this because he wasn't here when I gave the presentation.
Yeah. So far I'm tracking with you as far as like mototypical is concerned.
Okay, great. So the various modes that I was able to identify in my research, and I may not review all of them now. We'll talk about them more at the end of the show because this is something that Steve wanted to dig into, and I do too. But the mode textualism, meaning that the person adopts sort of a wooden, literal view of Scripture that includes things like infallibility, meaning that Scripture cannot have any sort of changes or variations over time, and that the meaning of Scripture would be obvious to all readers, regardless of their background, their cultural context, and their level of understanding. Textualism. Another mode of operation would be spiritualism. Spiritualism meaning that there's a heavy emphasis on the supernatural in the church setting. This would include things like ecstatic spiritual experiences, prophecies, miracles, or just sort of this idea that the universe is governed by the spiritual warfare of invisible angels around us, so that everything we see happening in the physical universe is a repercussion of something happening in the spiritual universe. General things like that. Does that make sense, Clinton?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Okay.
Although it does sort of raise a question, though, because spiritualism does play a large role in Christianity.
Sure.
Jesus, cast out demons because there were certain demons that would make a person sick. And so the question that's kind of come into my mind as you're talking about these modes that lead to deconversion are things like, how does a Christian church remain Christian and keep the supernatural elements while also trying to ensure that people aren't deconverting because of these particular things that might lead certain people to to reject the faith at some point.
Well, that's something I'd love to dig into at the end of the show when we go back into discussing these modes. To address something you just said, I'm not saying that these modes lead to deconversion. I'm saying that they are common elements that one finds in the background of people who deconvert.
Okay. Yeah, because I guess, yeah. All right. I may have been misunderstanding what you were saying, but so these aren't necessarily things that lead to deconversion, but these are these are sort of the things which who deconvert tended to have in their background?
Yes.
Okay.
One of the biggest ones, and I'll stop with this one, is isolationism. And isolationism is this idea that the church withdraws from the quote unquote world and tries to sort of by not interacting with the world. You kind of avoid any kind of relationship with people who are not themselves Christians, and even people who do not share your specific brand of Christianity, like a Protestant and Catholic don't mix, something like that. And it would also include things like avoiding sort of secular entertainment. So maybe just kind of stick with Christian, not listen to pop radio, or don't go out to see the R-rated movies. Just make sure you go out and see the movies that are approved by Focus on the Family, things like that. You basically withdraw from the secular community and kind of keep yourself isolated within the Christian community.
So in this case, what you kind of intend, because a lot of times Christian parents will say, don't go see R-rated movies, or don't listen to secular bands because there'll be bad influences. So it's kind of so you might actually be kind of having the reverse effect by keeping Christian kids or whomever from going out and experiencing these things.
Yeah. I mean, that's isolationism. The more isolated the individual is from the cultural context, the closer to pure isolation. So, I mean, you might be able to do a thing like see if the large majority of their friends are in the church youth group, but otherwise, they're free to go see movies and listen to pop radio, and they go to public school, and so that would be a very mild form of isolationism, because their peers, their friends, are mostly within the Christian community, but otherwise they interact with the cultural live. But I mean, the more of those things you withdraw from their lives, the closer they approach to pure isolationism. And pure isolationism would be like what you find in a cult, where they all live in the same commune. They have jobs that interact with that commune, and there's practically no interaction with the world around them. So I'll stop giving modes there. That there's more of them, but that review of the kinds of things that one finds in the backgrounds of deconverts. And then the next portion of the model, part 2, is the stressors. So what one finds is that as a person approaches deconversion, they become primed for deconversion through a variety of life stressors. And the stressors are things that relate specifically to their beliefs and consistent with their experiences. And this is where the setting conditions do come into a degree. So for instance, I'll take textualism. Bart Ehrman is famous for having, come from a background where it was sort of a high view of scripture. And then he runs into this scholarly problem where, there's some inconsistency between historical knowledge said in one of the gospels, and then his professor tells him, well, maybe the gospel writer just got it wrong. And this idea that a scripture writer could get something wrong became a stressor in his life that started to prime him for deconversion. And we just talked about isolationism. A stressor frequently related to isolationism is the person kind of steps outside of that Christian bubble and starts to interact with the world around, secular culture, and they're suddenly kind of exposed to all of these things they hadn't been before. They experience kind of a system shock, and there's an element of freedom felt because there was sort of the isolationism gave them a confined feeling versus the cultural context in which they can do whatever they want, and there's much more freedom in that context. So that's stressors. Involve questions about your faith, so doubts, for instance, and then moving outside of your Christian community. Those are big stressors. So any questions about stressors or comments, Clinton?
None that immediately spring to mind. I think I'm pretty well tracking with you here.
Yep. Okay. So the next stage is the trigger. It's an event that gives the person intellectual permission to start exploring the various doubts or problems that the stressors have brought about. Now, this is something I hadn't touched on the previous show, and I really want to talk about this for a bit, is what I call the prohibitive principle. And this is something I've stumbled upon pretty recently, I think since we did our show. So it's an important understanding what the trigger is. On previous, on a couple of atheist shows that I've been interviewed on about my model, they've asked, what's the difference between the trigger and the stressors? Is the trigger just another stressor? Well, the difference is that there is something that is keeping you from questioning your Christianity for most of your Christian life. Maybe it's a fear of the consequences of questioning, or this idea that it would be disloyal to your Christian community to ask questions or explore doubts about Christianity. Maybe it's guilt. You just would feel guilty if you did that. I recall, myself when I was young, like a child or a teenager, thinking about things like, well, what if God doesn't exist? And then I would, God would be angry at me for thinking that. So, that would be a prohibitive principle. So basically, a prohibitive principle is any kind of mindset that forbids you from questioning or exploring doubts or things like that. So before I continue, any questions about the prohibitive principle or comments?
I think I'm good.
Now, so does that fit anywhere? Like the prohibitive principle, does that fit anywhere specifically in the model?
Yeah.
Or like, in other words, is it a kind of stressor, or is it just it's a kind of stressor? Okay.
The prohibitive principle
Perfect.
isn't a stressor. The prohibitive principle is that which keeps you from exploring your doubts. So again, it might fear. What would happen if I explored these doubts? So the stressors are like priming you for deconversion. They're building at questions and doubts and various weaknesses in your faith, but there's something restraining you from exploring those things. You just kind of keep pushing them down, pushing them to the back. You keep from exploring them. And it's this principle that you hold that's keeping you from exploring them. The principle might be fear of the consequences of exploring those, or just general discomfort, cognitive dissonance if you were to explore it. So this is a principle. It's a mindset that keeps you from exploring, from asking those questions, from those doubts. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it doesn't actually live somewhere particular in the model, so to speak. It's just kind of something that's in the background, preventing people from really, whatever it is for them, it's keeping them from exploring further this idea that it could all be a sham or whatever, beginning to explore those questions.
It actually is important to the model because the trigger event, which I'm speaking about now, is that which removes the prohibitive principle. Let me give you an example. An example would be, let's say, actually a really good example actually happened. We're all familiar with it recently. The lead singer of Hawk Nelson. We all remember him?
Yeah, John Steingard.
Yeah, John Steingard. He recently, very famously and publicly deconverted. So John Steingard is traveling around with a band. He's sort of the leader. And, in addition to being the lead singer, he's the spiritual leader. So he's the one that's kind of holding devotionals and praying with everybody and so forth. And then at one, he steps down or he stops becoming the spiritual leader, and then he begins his deconversion process. So his prohibitive principle was a feeling of responsibility to the band. He couldn't really explore these things because he had this sense of responsibility. Once he moved away from that sense of responsibility, once he removed himself as spiritual leader, that prohibitive principle, this idea of, responsibility to the band, is no longer, that's what was keeping him from exploring the doubts. That's no longer there. It's been removed. So now he explores the doubts, and one of these things that you see so much in these stories is, as I've said, moving to college or moving to, a different church or, just moving, changing location, changing your peer group, tends to be a trigger because we're surrounded in this context or environment that prohibits those kinds of questions. We talked about the environmental control. That's not the term I used. Hold on a sec. Term I used was performance control. Do you remember that, Steve?
Yeah.
Okay.
Vaguely.
So we had talked about performance control, which is that controls your behavior. So, everybody within the environment looks down on certain behaviors because everybody else around them is looking down on those behaviors. And so it's sort of a self-perpetuating system. And everybody looks up to certain behaviors because everybody around them, elevates those behaviors. So again, it's a environment that kind of controls itself and perpetuates itself. So, that's one of these elements that you see in a modal typical church. And that performance control will also keep a person from asking those questions because within the environment that's looked down upon. And so they look down upon it. Everybody, it's just part of this environment. Once you move away from that environment, that prohibitive principle has been removed, and you now have permission to start exploring those doubts. And that's what the trigger is. Does that make sense? The trigger is that event which removes the prohibitive principle. Yeah. Okay. So after the trigger occurs, then we go into deconversion proper. Now, I characterized the process of my model, the part of the process, as either being a rescue attempt or a deconstruction. The difference is a rescue attempt is you really don't want to deconvert, and so you're trying to find ways of rescuing your belief. You're trying to find reasons why what you believe may be true. You're trying to defend your belief, and that just keeps falling apart until you lose your belief. Or is the process where you actively. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I was just going to say, so a rescue attempt then is specifically something that still results in you losing your faith?
Yeah,
because when I got out of high school, I went through a questioning phase, and I was questioning whether or not Christianity was something that could be defended rationally, or if it was just something that I believed because I was taught it as a kid. And so I went to the local Bible store, found some books on apologetics, and ultimately end up finding the answers to the questions that I was looking for. So that wouldn't specifically be considered a rescue attempt in this context, because I ended up keeping my faith.
That would be a successful rescue attempt. Now, you have to keep in mind that the only thing I've been studying are stories that come from atheists who deconverted. And so every single one of them is going to have a failed because they're atheists. They're the one telling the story. I haven't been getting stories from people who went through a circumstance like yours where, they began to have those doubts, they tried to rescue them, and then they successfully rescued them, because those stories just aren't, there's no blogospheres or YouTube channels or podcast interviewing people who successfully rescued their belief.
Right.
So I can't really speak to that as well, because I have that.
All right.
Yeah. So yeah, a rescue attempt would be one, and then the deconstruction would be the other avenue. Which a deconstruction is somebody who's found their religion or religious environment to be aversive, and they're actively trying to debunk or leave their beliefs or religion. And when you do that, it's the opposite. What you're doing is you're trying to and discard and attack each of those things that you've been brought up with. So creationism is a big one. And if you watch the Rhett and Link deconversion videos, this was a big one for them, especially Rhett, who just went around and was reading all of these books and debunking creationism essentially, and supporting evolution. And so, yeah, I mean, it's this idea that you start water of your faith until the pool is empty, or you start removing bricks from the wall of your beliefs until the wall is broken down. These are metaphors that they've actually used, people that I've looked into. So deconstruction is a much more aggressive process of deconversion than rescue. Rescue is sort of a frantic process of trying to keep yourself from discarding your beliefs. So that's my model. And the final part of my model is the deconversion process proper. Now, the deconversion would be the part of the process where you begin to actively identify as an atheist. You understand now that you are no longer religious, you no longer identify as religious, and you positively adopt the label of atheist. Now, sometimes this can happen sort of privately, and they never sort of step out, but for a period of time, they don't step out and make it public that they consider themselves an atheist. Sometimes they'll, especially in instances where a pastor deconverts, frequently the pastor will continue to be a pastor, teach and so forth, even though they no longer believe, because this is their livelihood. They're getting paid to do that. They've got a job. And what you'll see is like pastors will frequently try to find another line of work, step out as an atheist after they've established some other career for themselves. And so that's
something I'm kind of curious about now that you mentioned pastors who deconvert. What of the pastors who just decide to live as an atheist for a year and then end up losing their faith after living as an atheist? What does that fit into this kind of model?
I'm glad you brought that. It's very well into explaining how a rescue attempt might fail. Last time I spoke of two different kinds of rescue attempts. The first kind I said was content rescue. And content rescue is a process by which you're trying to rescue each specific belief that you have, because for any one of those beliefs to fall apart, the whole thing falls apart. So an example would be science. You're a creationist. If you were to come to the notion that evolution was true, you would be forced to believe that there is no God. And so what you end up doing is, getting creationist literature and following Ken Ham and so on and so forth to try to rescue that specific content of your belief. Other ways would be the term that I always forget, where you're trying to justify scripture by explaining how one thing could be true along with the other, and so forth.
Harmonizing?
Yes, thank you. Harmonizing. That's the word I'm looking. So harmonizing would be a part of a content rescue attempt. And then the other is the belief rescue. Now, this is what you're alluding to here. So, what you're talking about is Ryan Bell, who was famously the Year Without God guy.
Right, yeah.
His is a very good example of how belief rescue, of what it looks like. So Ryan Bell was originally a Seventh-day Adventist. And if you're familiar with Seventh-day Adventists, it's a pretty restrictive set of rules that they kind of enforce in those churches. So, women have to be modest, and, no drinking, no smoking, no dancing, no gambling, all that stuff.
You must worship on Saturdays, no other days.
Yeah, exactly. And, you're God's chosen people and so forth. So, he started out as a Seventh-day Adventist, and then he ended up pastoring a church where the women are wearing makeup and the guys were going outside and smoking. And he was put in a position where he would have to, as a pastor, either openly condemn those people or just allow that maybe those activities were okay and just kind of overlook them. So he chose option number 2. He decided that, let them do what they want. God still loves them. And then as he began to do that, became lax. He became convinced that, hey, these rules of the Seventh-day Adventists are probably a little too restrictive. Let's just go ahead and adjust those with the knowledge that God accepts everyone and loves everyone. And then when he allowed that this was the case, when he started to relax his rules, he began to question things like the role of women in church's approach to like LGBTQ issues. And so then he starts accepting those. And this is what I call leftward drift. And that is that the more restrictive your particular set of beliefs are, the more objections you're going to encounter to those beliefs. So one example I already mentioned was Bart Ehrman. And Bart Ehrman, had this problem with scriptural contradictions. And so what he did was he adopted a more theologically liberal position, which would allow for scriptural contradictions without discarding faith entirely. And what Ryan Bell did was he adopted a more of a socially liberal version of Christianity, which allowed for these less restrictive behaviors without discarding his belief. And so this in Belief Rescue is that they just kind of shimmy to the left a little bit, and that resolves the problem that they're having at that time. So if the church is too restrictive on some kind of political issue or social issue, just kind of step to the left a little bit, and that problem resolves itself. If scripture is a little too contradictory, or various scholarly errors have creeped in over to the left a little bit theologically, and that ceases to be a problem. So this is what I call leftward drift. Mm-hmm. And leftward drift is this constant, you step left in order to resolve a problem that you're currently encountering, and it's, and then it's fine. And this is what happened with Ryan Bell. He continued to, he focused less and less on, behaviors of Christians or even theology, and began to adopt more of a socially, kind of focus in his ministry, where, you're going out in the community and you're trying to help the community, and you're focusing on, racial issues and resolving women's issues and things like that. And, eventually he became so liberal, for lack of a better word, mm-hmm. that the Seventh-day Adventists asked him to step down as he was no longer pastor of that church. He couldn't be because they'd removed him. And so then he begins to travel in sort of the social justice spheres until he's working, shoulder to shoulder with humanists and atheists, more so than religious people. And at some point, someone asked him, well, what, here you are with the same values as us and the same beliefs as us, doing the same act, but you still believe in God. What difference does God make to you than it does to us? And this was a difficult question for him, because they were right. His values, his activities, everything that he was doing were consistent with what the humanists around him were doing. But for some reason, he was still believing that God was sort of central to these issues. And so that's when he launched the Year Without God thing, to see, what difference did God make beliefs and activities. And it turned out God didn't make a whole lot of difference, so eventually became an atheist. And, this is consistent with how leftward drift works in terms of deconversion. Eventually you step so far left that God becomes unnecessary and perhaps a little too restrictive. Make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's my model. And that was at least the review of my model. Before we step into the salvific issues, anything we want to talk about with the model?
I think I'm pretty good on the model. I think I'm tracking with you.
All right, fantastic. All right, so whenever I talk to Christians about my research, inevitably the first thing they'll bring up a Christian anyway. This idea that if somebody deconverts, they were never really converted in the first place. And this is, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's actually a belief I used to hold. It comes from, I believe, a verse in First John where John writes, they went out from us, but they were never of us, because if they had been of us, they would not have gone out from us. I've kind of relaxed my views on falling away a little bit. Like I now hold the view where it's possible for someone to lose his salvation because someone can walk away from God's promises. I still think it's true that nothing can separate you from God. Like if you're in God's hand, nothing can take you out of it. But that passage doesn't say that you can't freely leave. So I've become a little more lax on that. That's definitely something that I believed as a Southern Baptist, because the whole once saved always saved kind of thing.
Yeah. So if you want to really insult an atheist, tell them that they were never really a Christian to begin with.
Yeah.
This is something they find extremely insulting.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no doubt. That's probably not something you want to say if you want to be successful in evangelizing them. But they also hold an erroneous view that just because they were a Christian, they think they understand Christianity and the Bible as well as or better than most Christians do. Just because they were a Christian, when if you really dig down into their views, you actually realize that they actually didn't understand it at all, which is one of the things that led to them leaving. So there's kind of two sides to that coin, that the atheists can make unwarranted assumptions based on their previously being Christians, just like the Christian can.
So when I read or listen to these deconversion stories, person speaking will then go into an attempt to prove that they were in fact a real Christian, because they tend to be sort of hyper aware that this is something Christians are going to say when they hear the story, is that they were never really a Christian anyway, and they're really interested in proving, no, I really was a Christian. And so when they offer these evidences, what they tend to offer are about three different evidences. Certain atheists will offer their behaviors as evidence of their deconversion. So, for instance, they used to go out and evangelize, and they were very proud of themselves when somebody knelt and received Christ as their Savior. Or they went to church 3 times a week, or they were in their closet praying every night, or they read their, basically just different Christian-y behaviors. And so they'll offer that.
I'll chime in here real quick. I try and do this thing where we go out and do surveys every once in a while.
Yep.
Easier before a pandemic, but
yeah,
in the part of the country I'm in, we encountered lots of Christians, at least people who would claim the label Christian, and we were doing religious surveys. What is your worldview? What religion do you subscribe to? That sort of thing.
Yeah, well, you're in Virginia, so
right. And in talking to people, we would get those same kinds of answers from people, because we added a question that says, what is the core, as a Christian, what are your core beliefs? And, sadly, every time we spoke to Christians who, claimed the label Christian, the answer was, I'm a good person. I try and follow Jesus' example living. It was never the gospel that Jesus died for my sins, so I'm redeemed by that. that was never the answer as to what the core of Christianity was. It was, I did this, I did this, I do this, I try to do this.
Mhm.
So, I'm not trying to support the view that these people were never saved who deconvert, but that's a very common misconception, even among people who may be regular churchgoers or, may claim the label of Christian all their life. It's very common to think the core of that is, I do this, I try to do this, versus what the actual gospel is.
Yeah, I mean
that's
yeah,
that's a good thought. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. Although I think just if we're going to talk about, just for the sake of trying to be persuasive with them, if we know that that it's going to offend them to say, well, you were never a Christian to begin with, we might think it, based on what they've been telling us. But I think at least there are pragmatic reasons why we can avoid, making that sort of statement, even if it's true, even if they were never legitimately saved because, they had a false view of how you got saved, or, they never made that public profession of faith, or whatever it is that that is missing from them. I think at least for pragmatic reasons, we can just, not bring that up, even if it might be true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think a story that I can tell that might kind of drive that further, that this is really a problem even amongst people right now who by all indications are currently some of the most committed Christians I've ever met. So I come from a church background that is very heavily biased toward, I'm probably putting it lightly to even say it that way, towards King James onlyism, right? Like that is all over my background. And so there's a pastor in our type of church who is well known, and he's out in California, and he would be more on if you have to use the analogy of right wing, left wing, if you have to say that, then he's on the left of center, although I think he's probably biblically closer. Am I making any sense? So he's some people would see him as left, other people would look at him and just say, oh no, you're actually like being biblical. So just anyway, so he writes this 3-part series a while back on his personal blog dealing with this issue of King James onlyism. And basically, and I think the position he holds right now is even like a TR, like Texas Receptus, primary kind of position. He still even holds to that. And one of the things that, if you look through the comments in this series of posts, it's just, there's all kinds of characters who show up from across the spectrum. This one person showed up and said, this guy kind of makes some really good points, but he sounds like he could be a little off. I just would love to have a conversation with him and see what, really to make sure he was doctrinally sound, and see where he stood on the core beliefs of Christianity, like how women should dress. And I'd love to know if he's a Calvinist or not. And I'd love to know if he goes, what his position is on soul winning visitation every Saturday morning. And it was honestly, it was one of the most, instructive. Let's put it nicely. It was one of the most instructive moments of my life. Because he actually came back, the person who wrote the blog series. So he came back and commented on that, and he didn't directly reply to the guy, but he said, for everyone looking on, I just want you to understand basically the fundamental problem that's been highlighted here. This person literally said, I would love to know, sounds great, but I'd love to know where he stands on the core doctrines of Christianity, and did not mention anything that is even close to a core doctrine of Christianity. And so, what I want to say about that is, relevant to what has been brought up. I think Clinton just makes an absolutely wonderful point about maybe there are pragmatic reasons not to go there. And I'll admit, and I'll reiterate, like I told Caleb last time, I said, this is almost a topic that for me raises more questions when I look to it now, because of just growing in the Lord. And a lot of times you get a lot less certain on things, which is ironic, but there are things that you're more willing to be open to. And, so I'm by no means am I like, sold, hook, line, and sinker necessarily on one view. But if you look at what's going on in 1 John 2:19, it's and if you take into which is that verse that Clinton mentioned, where it's like, if they were with, if they had been one of us, if there are many antichrists now, if they had been one of us, they would have remained with us, but they're not one of us. And this happened so that they could show that they weren't one of us. If you look at that and you think that has relevance to Christians even today, which I think the case could be made from that passage that it does, and you take into consideration last time where I said, I really think that it's impossible just to know unless you're omniscient, who is actually saved. Somebody can claim it all they want to, but who actually does have eternal life. Like, it would be impossible to know unless you're omniscient. It does look like that group of people has to be talking about somebody. So I think I totally get the pragmatic reasons for not saying, oh yeah, you were never a Christian in the first place. But it's just interesting to me that with what Caleb said and what I said, that view that I wrote it down this way. I don't know if it's the best way of putting it, but I wrote it down as the false assumption that activity or Christian activity is equal to evidence of true belief in Christianity. I hope that's a somewhat fair way to say it. It might not be totally accurate, but I think y'all see what I mean. If that's the case, then it's no surprise to me that Christ says that you're going to have all these people who come to him one day and say, Lord, Lord, like, what on earth? Like, I've done all these things in your name, and I've healed the sick, and I've done this, and I've cast out demons, and I've done this. And he says, yeah, but you never really knew me. And if that could be true of all of these people who right now are in the middle of claiming they are a Christian and showing all of this belief stuff, then I guess all I'm saying is it's quite possible that the claim you were never a Christian at all has some merit to it. I'm not saying we would say that. I'm just saying, in light of all these things that we're talking about, I can see where that, and taken with some scriptural examples to boot, I can see where that claim and that thinking has some definite merit. I hope that makes some sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
Before we get too deep down that rabbit hole, I'd like to mention the other reasons that they give for being Christian. So we just talked about their behaviors. Probably behaviors might be the most common one, but it's definitely rivaled by experiences is the other reason that they'll give. And so if you recall, I said that spiritualism tends to be a common element of these kind of setting conditions. And so that being the case, many of these sort of these intense spiritual experiences they had, instances when they thought they were having a direct conversation with God, or that Jesus was walking along with them. These intense worship experiences they had, in some cases speaking in tongues or prophesying, performing miracles, all of these experiences that they had that convinced them that they were indeed Christian or had God. So that's a very common thing that they'll give. Essentially, it's like giving their testimony, only not their testimony, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I think within the church today, too, we have a lot of people who put a lot of weight on that kind of emotional experience as well. You see this heavily within the LDS church, is that there's so much put on experience, and I experienced this miracle, or I know this is true because I just feel it to be true. But it's really not just the LDS church. It's moved in and seeped into the general church as well. And rather than being grounded in Scripture and the reasons for Scripture being true, and maybe even bringing in some skepticism when borderline supernatural events occur, they grapple on to something like the classic example of, I was going to the store, I was in a big hurry, the parking space. This parking space just freed up because I prayed about it.
Yeah.
That's not the best example to cling to when we're looking at miraculous. Now, on our premium content, we have a discussion with Mike Lacona that I had on there. And, that was a great discussion. And of course, we have some disagreements in terms of the weight given to supernaturalism and kind of these experiential moments. But I think beside that, this has seeped into the church so much, it's no surprise that so many deconverts kind of have this as an issue.
Yeah, so you had mentioned last time we had this conversation, Caleb, the deconversion of magicians, and it's interesting because you'll sometimes, or I'll sometimes hear these worship leaders who have deconverted, and they'll talk about how they actively cultivated this sort of spiritual experience within the church, where they would make sure to kind of bring in the music and kind of bring it up as the pastor is concluding the sermon, or during the altar call, they try to do some kind of trick with stir up that spiritual experience. And in the worship in general, they try to do various techniques to create this sort of worshipful, moving experience within the audience. And so a lot of the job of these worship leaders, some of these worship leaders, no offense, Clinton, was to sort of cultivate and create the illusion of having a very spiritual experience. And you'll see this. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, as a worship leader, there are certain practices from worship bands that I disagree with, and they make it more difficult for me as a contemporary worship leader to make the case that contemporary worship is appropriate. Because when I tell people that I'm a contemporary worship leader, they might get in their heads, fog machines, shallow lyrics, trying to elicit an emotional response instead of trying to appeal to the intellect, and things like that. And so there are certain things that even as I as a worship leader, as a contemporary worship leader, believe are inappropriate for worship. And I cling to the old hymns. I love hymns, and I play for the liturgy also at my church. I attend a Lutheran church, but contemporary worship is really where my passion lies as far as actually playing it. And so, so those kinds of things can, give people or at least make it more difficult for me to make the case that contemporary worship is appropriate for churches also.
Right. But the illusionist thing for Caleb, because a lot of the techniques I just mentioned are not unfamiliar to illusionists, especially like mentalists and so forth, that are trying to sort of manipulate the audience, their feelings and their thoughts, to prime them to for certain beliefs or behaviors. In that respect, go ahead.
I was just kind of curious. So who are some of the illusionists that you were talking about who've deconverted?
Well, you've got a handful. I know one that Joe looked at was Darren Brown. Mm-hmm. But in addition to that, you've got people like Penn from Penn and Teller, Penn Jillette.
He used to be a Christian?
I don't know that he used to be a Christian. I'm not sure exactly what his background was. He's definitely a very staunch atheist now.
Is he?
Yeah. Penn and Teller are both atheists. They're also libertarians, though, incidentally.
Some atheists are.
What's interesting is Penn Jillette is, according to some Pew studies, more in the camp of proselytism than many millennial Christians. Right. So I don't know if you've ever seen that video of Penn Jillette. Yeah, I think all of us probably have at some point. But yeah, that's that's a detour, but
Right.
Yeah, I think I give him a lot of credit for that video. Though I do have some respect for that kind of approach. But you've also got people, and this goes back a ways. You've got James Randi, who's been one of the most outspoken skeptics around a long time. And then, of course, Matt Dillahunty was somewhat of an amateur magician as well. Those are kind of the main ones that come to mind as having been at least involved in the world of illusion at some point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, just talking about cultivating this sort of spiritual experience, we see this in classically in high church, like in Catholicism, where they build these stained glass windows and they create this sort of environment, aesthetic environment that, brings out this sort of spiritual experience. And you were talking about LDS. They're known for doing that as well. You see their churches, they're very extravagant in trying to...
Temples.
Sorry.
Temples.
I was going to say temples, but yeah, anyway, you get the point. They're extremely extravagant. They put a lot of work of this artificial heaven that the worship occurs in. And then in high church, they have the liturgy and, these readings and callings and callbacks and all of these rituals that are meant to sort of simulate sort of a spiritual experience. And then you see this also in like a Pentecostal type church where sort of the rhythm of the preaching and the kinds of, again, this is, talk about environmental control. Everybody else is in a thing. And then I become convinced that I had that experience. So yeah, churches are complicit in simulating these sort of spiritual experiences. And once that kind of falls apart, once you see behind the curtain and see how that trick was done, it can be very disillusioning.
I watched, just a side note, watched a rather Pentecostal-esque, I think it was kind of non-denominational, but it was definitely Pentecostal camp kind of sermon the other week. And, one of the things they used was, after an hour of music of really kind of gearing people up, then the pastor got up and started talking about, well, if you don't speak in tongues, if you don't try this, then you don't have the Spirit of God within you. And so then they start babbling off. Tongues, as I understand it, was very much a being able to understand different languages and speaking in multiple languages at the same time versus this kind of thing.
My mother was a saint. You shut up.
But it was just gearing up, and I mean that really was kind of the illusion behind it, is get people revved up and then show them what to do, give them an example of it, and then tell them if they don't do it, it's the same techniques hypnotists use.
Yeah, when I hear something like that, like a Pentecostal preacher or something saying, if you don't speak in tongues, you don't have the Spirit of God or anything like that, I think of that meme. I'm trying to think of who's in the picture of it. It might be James White, or it might be John Piper, or some well-known evangelist or evangelical preacher, and he's like holding out a Bible, or it might be like R.C. Sproul or Tim Keller or something like that. But he's holding out a Bible, and the caption says, "Excuse me, but I'm having trouble finding this nonsense in my Bible."
Yeah. So, the speaking in tongues, and it may be that we have some listeners that are sold on that. I am not. But I think that would be an example of performance control, because you're in an environment where everyone else around you is doing it. And so you do it, and you're convinced because everyone is doing it that it's a real thing. The person next to you becomes convinced by your performance that it's a real thing. And so it's a self-perpetuating process.
Yeah. And now to be clear, I'm not necessarily saying that about speaking in tongues, period. I don't necessarily believe in the sign gifts, but I'm talking specifically of the people who say that if you don't speak in tongues, you don't have the Spirit of God. I don't want to alienate any listeners.
Yeah. So that would be my take on that. So yeah, that's the second. Then the final one that they'll give to explain why they believe they were a Christian is the beliefs that they had. Now, honestly, beliefs are the least frequent that I've found. And it's interesting to me because the beliefs are also the most compelling. They're the ones that become most convincing to me that they may, in fact, have been a Christian, or at least, because for me, and possibly for you as well, the things that you believe are part of Christianity are more convincing than your behaviors or your experiences. So, for instance, as a Christian, I believe that, we misbehave. That's the whole reason I am a Christian, is because, I am convinced that I am not capable of behaving in a perfect way, which is acceptable to a holy God. And therefore come to God in repentance and, accepted that forgiveness for my misbehaviors. And so, behaviors it seems to me that those people who rely on their behaviors to, to indicate that they were in fact Christians don't quite grasp the fact that, the whole point of Christianity is that you're not capable of the without God. So there's that. And then experiences, again, we've just talked about how those can be simulated, and they're not necessarily very convincing of Christianity. But the beliefs are the ones that really persuade me of the most, because, occasionally they have a very good grasp on doctrine. Often they don't, but occasionally they do. Thoughts on that?
One immediate thought in my mind, and I don't know that this is, I'll just say it. I mean, the Bible does pretty specifically say that, even, basically Satan and his minions believe and then also tremble. So I kind of wonder where that comes into play. I get what you're saying, because it does really seem that a lot of these guys can very accurately articulate what the Christian message is. And so at the risk of just repeating a pastorism, maybe even the way that Lee Strobel, if I can even remember how he puts it, maybe even that is something that would be helpful. But it's kind of like the whole, it's like the difference in believing with your head, versus actually receiving with your heart. And that's kind of the thing that you can't really know, that only God knows, I think. But it seems to me we have to somehow make a distinction between being able to articulate the claims of Christianity, and even saying that we believe it, and actually, truly believing that what Christ did legitimately is going to rescue us from whatever damnation, eternal torment, whatever it is that you believe in, we're headed for. So I'm not really giving a solution here. I'm just saying, yeah, that's interesting, because the devil believes and trembles also. So like, what's the distinction between the belief of the devil and the belief of the person who claims to have been a Christian?
Yeah. So what I'd like to do is read a testimony to you, and see what you think about this testimony. And then I'll tell you the individual in the background of the person giving the testimony. Let's see if I can find. So this is a person who grew up in a Christian community, and so much so that he never remembers as a child ever meeting or talking to anybody who was unbeliever. And after high school, he kind of dropped out. No, I'm sorry. He dropped out of high school and he began hitchhiking across the country. So he went through a rebellious stage. And as he was hitchhiking, he began partying pretty hard, and he caught up in the drug, sex, alcohol, fast car scene, the whole deal. And then, after living like that, it brought him low. And, he remembers back to his Christian upbringing, and he realizes that his hope for, at this point, he's in the gutter. All of the pursuits that he's had have been disappointing to him, and he remembers that his best hope. And so he says, quote, "I can identify with the Apostle Paul, who said, 'But by the grace of God, I am what I am.' I knew I needed help, but no one could break through to me until I turned my life over to Jesus. Only he could save me. Only he could change me. I have totally changed due to the grace of God. When I look back in those years, it's like I'm talking about someone else. Without God, I shudder today. Now I gladly preach the message that God can change you too. Believe it. It happened in my life. Believe that it can happen in your rebellious teenager. Believe it, because we serve a miracle working God who answers prayer, who intervenes on our behalf." Then I ended the devotional with these words, quote, "From out of my own personal experience, my heart bleeds for the victims in our society, for I know what it's like to be a victim. That's why I fight for the unborn, the poor, and the homeless, those victimized by pornography, but especially for those trapped in sin. People need the Lord." Okay, thoughts on that?
Where's my 10-foot pole? I need to.
Yeah, I mean, what do you say? I mean, it sounds like a person who went through an experience and claims to have came up from the other side of the valley. I mean, whether or not, again, I'm not, maybe it's an open-ended question, so I'm not really sure what kind of answer to even give here. But I mean, yeah, in terms of what it sounds like, it sounds like somebody, they didn't go out of their way to, it didn't sound like they were doing, systematic or philosophical theology there. It was like, okay, well, I had this experience of remembering back to my childhood and seeing this, remember feeling this particular way, and in some sense remembering back to the way that they thought about things back then, and remembering that they had gotten their mind off of Christ and that he was the answer to their problem. So that's about as far as the testimony went. Sin was mentioned, so that's something to think about. There was this recognition in the testimony. There was this recognition that it's not just a matter of unfortunate circumstances; it's a matter of being enslaved to sin. So that was articulated well, that point of it. But that's as far as it went.
It reminds me of any kind of testimonial you read for a medication or this or that. Like it's the same kind of testimonial here. Now that's not to discredit it. It may be very true of the experience somebody had, but it does sound like an experience to me versus a kind of lengthy continuum of multiple experiences that build a belief and a foundation in a belief.
Okay. Well, that was an article published in the Republican Herald on August 10th of 1990, and it was written by a young man by the name of John Loftus. Ever heard of him?
Once or twice.
The name rings a bell.
Yeah. Probably one of the more convincing testimonies to show that I truly was a Christian, because these are actual words that he wrote while he was a pastor, talking about his conversion experience, giving his testimony. Right. So this is a pure example of a testimony that's not given in retrospect, because he's pulling out words he wrote at that time about his experience.
Yeah. Let me chime in here with something. So there's in Southern gospel music, this is a world that I have spent a lot of time in. By the way, they're having a 40 days and 40 nights Southern gospel music extravaganza next year at the Ark Encounter. If any of y'all are interested in joining in on that goodness,
You know what? I love music festivals, and I would totally be there if I recognized any of the acts they were bringing in. Like if they brought in Skillet or 1,000-Foot Crutch or Theocracy or Death, bands like that, I'd totally be there. But it's like
you're not gonna find them.
Yeah,
no.
So, sorry, I won't be attending.
Okay, yeah, no worries, no worries. Anyway,
need a Mentionables music festival at this point. Let's get those.
That would be cool.
I'm all for it.
Yeah,
I'm all for it. So this is an anecdote, okay, but I think it might be a little helpful. So there is a Southern gospel tenor singer from a group. Their name is the Gold City Quartet. They've been around for 100 years. And this particular guy's name is Jay Perrick. He's not with them anymore. He does his own solo ministry now. Okay. And his name is Jay Perrick. And his dad was also a very well-known and very successful Southern gospel tenor singer, Johnny Perrick. So, I mean, the guy literally grows up on a bus, playing music full time. He spends, the majority of, he knows everybody that you could possibly know in that world. I mean, he's as big as you get doing his thing. And, during some of my years growing up, he was, I loved their music. And so he was a huge influence on my life. I kind of identified with the guy. I've always had a little bit higher pitched voice. I get called a woman in just about every drive-through I go through. And, I love the sound of Southern gospel music and tenor singing. So I loved this guy. He was, all the songs that he sings on these albums, like I could sing along with him. Like I haven't heard him in probably 5 or 10 years at this point, but I guarantee you if those albums came on, I could sing along with him. I've seen him live 100 times. I've seen him testimonies, this, that, and the other thing, yada, yada, yada. Okay. Point is this guy was a Christian, right? Like there's just no doubt about it. And yet I saw a video of him a few years ago, doing ministry stuff, telling his testimony about how he faked it for all those years. And then finally got saved. And became a follower of Christ and went out in his ministry activities and was sorry and of a very repentant spirit for the way he was back then. Basically talking the talk. They even had a song that was about that, which is extremely ironic, but basically talking the talk, but not actually walking the walk. And that particular anecdote is one that kind of breaks for me this assumption that no matter how convincing it is, that there is still that possibility that is part of the act, because you see this guy who, trust me. Like I said, I saw the guy a bunch. I heard him talk a bunch. He would introduce songs. He would cry, sharing the stories. It was about as convincing as it was. And he himself admitted that even back then, that it was an act. So, I'm with you. I think that Loftus thing, I had a feeling it was going to be like one of the most high profile atheists, that there was, and certainly it was. But after seeing that one example, I'm just like, man, there's almost, I couldn't think of anybody in my life growing up that had much more of an influence than him, and yet admitted that it was all a show. So I don't know.
Yeah. I guess it's probably the same even in the Southern gospel world, but in the CCM, Christian pop rock world, you can't guarantee that every musician up there playing songs for Jesus is a believer. I know specifically one band that I listened to, a band named PFR, who were pretty big in the 90s. They had a drummer named Mark Nash, and he was actually an atheist when he started playing.
Named Goldie?
Goldie's Last Day. That was their second second album, I believe. Yeah, Goldie's Last Day, of course, written for Joel. What's his name? I'm blanking on. I'm like the lead singer's name, Joel. Joel
Good
something.
name.
Yeah. I figured you'd appreciate that. But yeah, is written for his dog, I believe. But Mark Nash was their drummer, and he was an atheist. He eventually ended up getting saved, and then marrying Lee Bingham of Sixpence None the Richer. So she's Lee Nash now. But yeah, so not everyone up there playing songs for Jesus is a believer. Sometimes it turns out great, like with PFR's drummer. Other times, not so much. Sometimes they're just there for a paycheck and don't really take the music they play seriously.
Did Sixpence None the Richer ask him to kiss her out in the cold moonlight?
Probably. And yeah, so a little bit of trivia is that Lee Bingham, who's now Lee Nash, married the drummer for PFR. But another piece of trivia is that Sixpence None the Richer was actually discovered by Steve Taylor, who was responsible for making the Newsboys good. And he was a well-known Christian new wave singer from the 80s. So Steve Taylor is one of those guys you need to know if you like classic rock, especially classic Christian rock. But he was the guy who discovered Sixpence None the Richer. Just a little bit of music trivia there.
Yeah, don't keep that going. We could be here all night.
Okay, so just one more thing, one more piece of trivia there. I guess we could talk about degrees of separation. But PFR was actually on the way to the Grammys one year and came upon Weird Al Yankovic, whose vehicle had broken down on the side of the road, and so they ended up giving him a lift to the Grammys. They suggested that he should parody one of their songs, but he never did.
Now that
sounds like a story you'd tell.
Right.
I'd like that verified by PFR and Weird Al.
Well, no, it was in actually it was in this book here, the Encyclopedia of Contemporary Christian Music, by Mark Allen Powell, who just happens to be a Lutheran theologian. He actually tells the story in his entry on PFR.
Oh,
so
I guess that's
believe him.
That's about as close as he got to a real life Amish paradise, huh?
Pretty much, yeah, right.
All right, so
churning lots of butter.
So raise the barn on Monday, soon we'll raise another.
All right.
You better be careful. Clinton doesn't know this about me, but I played professional music for quite a long time. I could talk all night long about music. That's my jam.
Yeah, no, so could I. I'm a classically trained musician, so I actually have a little bit of experience touring, and I play professionally in that I get paid by my church and I gig around town in classic rock tribute bands. I wanted to get to the point where I could be in like a signed band and do the touring thing full time. Never worked out for me because I live in Fresno, not Los Angeles, but that was always kind of a dream of mine. And I think Caleb's trying to move us along here. But no, I mean, we should have a music discussion sometime.
Yeah, you should break into the bluegrass and Southern gospel world. It's easier to get into. They even let me in. So.
Actually, my stepbrother actually plays in a bluegrass band.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
There's
I want to see a couple of white Christian music nerds doing a rap battle. That's what I'd like to see.
Yeah.
There's somebody out there who this sells them for the whole episode, and they go sign up for Patreon right now.
There we go. Yeah. Actually, we should do that as a special for the Patreon subscribers. We could just do like a music discussion.
I'm all about it.
Yeah, bring John Dunbar on and set us loose.
Yeah. All
Absolutely.
Right. So,
all right.
Let me give my take on the salvation thing. I don't have I try to, in order to keep intellectual integrity as a researcher, I really try not to step into the question of salvation. But if I were to, I would say that the model that's consistent to me would be the parable of the sower and the seeds given by Jesus. Because in this parable, you see an instance in which you have the seed and it falls in the ground and it begins to sprout. And then in various circumstances, the sprouting is discontinued and never fulfilled. And so the interesting thing about that is that the various under which we see these sprouts dying are similar to the kind of circumstances we see when a deconversion occurs. So I'm saying that of the things I read in scripture, this one seems the most consistent. I don't want to draw that parallel exactly. I'm not staking a flag in that, but I'm saying that this one, if I were to look at scripture for a parallel, that's the one that I would look at. All right. Well, okay, so moving on from the scriptural examples, the other thing that's interesting to me is that in all the cases I studied, and I know deconversion researchers that had more of a budget because they actually work for a university, and so they conducted the same kind of experiment or research as I did, except that they did direct interviews with, and they were able to draw from a much wider base so that they could kind of control for various factors. But the ones that I studied, none of them had a uh, a conversion experience which was consistent with the technical conversion experiences in conversion research. And I talked about this, that I do both deconversion and conversion, and so there are a number of models of conversion that correlate pretty well with each other. And you don't see these deconverts go through any of these conversion models. What you see deconverts doing is being born and raised in a church. They begin to identify as Christian very young. In one poll that I conducted online, the majority of people who said that they began to identify as a Christian prior to attending between ages 0 and 5 is when they began to identify as Christians. And so they never went through a formal conversion process. For those that did, it was kind of like an altar call, and they'd been raised in a church, they attended an altar call, and that's when they began to really identify as Christians. Or one instance, it was this a young boy whose teacher kind of participating in the church's kids ministry, and he kind of became involved and made friends in the kids ministry, and then eventually decided he was a Christian because everybody else was a Christian. And so this fact that you don't see a lot of formal conversions might be an indication of something, and I'm not going to go and say what, but I'll leave that hanging out there to do as you will with. Now, having said that, I mentioned other deconversion research controlling for things, and the one that I'm thinking he would only select subjects that ourselves as going through a definite conversion. So there are findings out there that contradict what I just said, but I wasn't able to find any that went through a formal conversion process, which is interesting to me. Any thoughts on that? No? Okay. All right. So
yeah, no, pretty good. No, I was just saying I think we're tracking with you pretty good here.
Okay. So it's
interesting. I don't know anything about it yet.
Okay, fair enough. The last thing I want to do is make a distinction between conversion and salvation. Conversion is a behavioral process. So when I talk about models of conversion, we can talk about what kinds of things that they professed at first in a pre-religious stage, and then the kinds of behaviors you see, environmental conditions that they transition through, and then the behaviors at the point at which the researcher identifies them as being religious. So that, at that point, the researcher would look for things like involvement in the religious community, behaving as everybody else in the community does, transition through several stages of behavior, and exhibiting certain kinds of behaviors. So again, what I'm saying is that conversion is a behavioral process. It's a process that I can see, I can take notes on, and I can catalog, versus salvation, which is a theological issue. And so when you say that a person deconverted, what you're saying is that their behavior changed, They no longer behaved as a Christian. They are now behaving as, and when they self-report, meaning they tell you what kinds of things they're thinking and, you know, their various emotional experiences and so forth, that's a kind of behavior. But we can only take their word for what's going on in their head. And another thing that has to be taken into account is that when I sit down and listen to a deconversion story, I'm listening to a story being told by an atheist about a Christian. This atheist is going back and remembering the experiences. Yes, go ahead.
You cut out just a little bit there. Can you repeat that for us?
Sure. When I listen to a deconversion story, I'm listening to a story being told by an atheist. It's narrated by an atheist from an atheist point of view about a Christian. So they're talking about a person that they used to be.
Yeah, okay.
The Christian, and you know, now they're giving their perspective as an atheist on them being a Christian. So in that respect, you have to allow for the fact that they're now interpreting those events through the lens of an atheist. Now, to talk about that for just a second, Steve, I saw your mute went off. You want to say something?
I have more of just a question for you, but I think maybe finish your thoughts here and then I can ask it.
Well, I'm going to go into quite a thought here, so why don't you ask your question, then I'll...
Okay, fair enough. Well, I think my question might be quite a question too, because I'm trying to make this really practical, if for nobody else, for me. And on the question ways. And so it comes later, but for the catalog, if nothing else, what I specifically want to know is, you know, you approach this research as an unbiased researcher, and I and our cohorts here and all of your fellow researchers, I'm sure, very much appreciate that. I'm just very interested to know this. I mean, this has been a long research project for you, and I'll just put out my note that I didn't realize when I was invited to come on these couple shows that like this was you like actually giving out this research into the world. And I feel honored, frankly, because I've been following it for a little while. I was like, holy yeah, like I totally get to be a part of this. This is cool. But I want to know what your takeaways are as a theologian from the research that you have done. And now that some of that might be answered by this distinction you're making between conversion and salvation. You might have no takeaways, but I feel like if there are zero takeaways, that might be a little bit disappointing from this audience who is primarily theologians and not conversion researchers. So I'm sure you have some thoughts on that. So at some point, I would love to know what, if any, theological takeaways there are for everyone to kind of dig their teeth into from your study.
So the problem is that it's hard to disentangle the behaviorist from the theologian, because, you know, if we're talking about preventing deconversion, then a lot of those setting conditions would have to be fiddled with as being the things which are most responsible for setting the person up for deconversion, because those setting conditions become the foundation for the triggers, or I'm sorry, the stressors that the person experiences later on. But again, that's purely a behaviorist thing. I'm talking about how to change the environment to cultivate certain behaviors, and that's kind of the territory in which I travel.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I can jump in, I mean, I think that has extreme theological relevance, because oftentimes these setting conditions, and this kind of goes into some of the modal typical church stuff you'd mentioned, but like, you know, I mean, they're unbiblical. They're in many cases, it's the exact kind of crap that Jesus came along to teach against that is going on. So yeah, there's lest anyone think there is not. Yeah, there is tremendous theological application from that. So yeah.
Right. And again, like I said, it's difficult to disentangle those things because, yeah, hopefully in a second I'll shut up and we can start talking about modal typical churches again, which is kind of the direction this conversation is threatening to wander into.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, as far as the deconversion thing, I mean, as a Christian, I'm still sort of on the hinge of once saved, always saved, but I want to say that there is a difference between versus conversion.
Yeah.
Again, conversion is a set of behaviors. Salvation is a theological issue and says less about the individual and more about God.
Yeah, because an atheist could theoretically convert to Christianity and engage in all the rituals and everything, but never actually be a saved Christian, because that's more of a heart and devotion issue to God.
This I wanted to bring up, but then I'd forgotten about. But as a behaviorist, one of the things we really try to look for is what they call experimental control. Now, in terms of behavior, here's what experimental control would be. Let's say your kid is waking up every night and crying. All right. So then you go and you put a nightlight in their room, and suddenly they stop waking up and crying. All right. So it seems pretty evident that the nightlight has. So as a behavior analyst, what I would then do is go in and remove the nightlight and then see if their rate of crying returns to what it was prior to putting the nightlight in. Because once I get them to revert to the previous behavior, the one that I was trying to eliminate, then I can see that the nightlight was in fact the independent variable which affected the crying, which was the dependent variable. So this is how experimental control works. And so what was really informative to me was finding instances in which a person identified as Christian, deconverted and identified as an atheist, and then converted and identified as a Christian again. Because what you could do then is take a snapshot of the Christian they were prior to deconversion, and then a snapshot of the Christian they were after they reconverted, and then do a side-by-side comparison to see what changed. The dependent and independent variables that may be responsible for that deconversion. And so I see, it's difficult to find examples of that, but I've found examples of that. And I won't go into them right now because I don't have notes in front of me and I'm trying to operate off of memory, which is not a tremendous asset of mine. But,
that was quite the teaser. What a carrot. I have the solution.
I mean, that might be something that I should, bring in my research and notes and do another episode on that. I don't have time now.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is I can't find an instance where a person was an atheist, then converted to Christianity, and then deconverted to atheism. Now, I am not saying that those don't exist. I am saying that I have not yet run up against one. And, several of the followers of my research have heard such stories. So if I can get somebody to give me one of those stories, I'd love to take a look at them to get that kind of information, which is important for my research. Anyways, I was going to go into a thing, and I'm forgetting what I was going to go into.
This has just really been a big aha for me. And I know we've talked about this a lot, but still it's never really hit me quite this distinction between conversion and salvation and being a behavioral matter on the conversion side. And that's really, really interesting and really important. Nobody goes into a marriage planning they're going to cheat on their spouse, but behavior is one thing versus an actual salvific act. So I think that's a distinction that can't be understated in this matter. That to me is, if that was the only takeaway from this research, that's huge. I mean, that means the church is probably filled with people who very much think they're saved, who very much believe, I've got this. I'm doing the Christian thing. and who have no idea what it may mean.
And the irony there, and again, I speak to this, if I may, coming from a church background who, I mean, I consider much of the kind of background that I come from extremely legalist, right? It's very behavior driven. And what you have is these people. Yes, it is very modal typical, I believe. Don't get me wrong. There are others who say this kind of thing about the kind of background that I come from. I mean, I'm still in a church that is somewhat from this background, but it's not like it's a good church. It's a great church, actually. So I have more to thank for my upbringing than I do to have a problem with it. I'll just put it that way. Anyway, but so much is performance and behavior driven. From the top down, just there's basically this sense. I mean, really, if you were going to summarize it, it's this sense that the more you do for God, the more favor he returns, and the kind of the more that you're willing to do for God is almost like supposed to balance out with assurance of salvation of some sort. If you're a person who's willing to do a whole bunch for God, then you're more and more likely, to be a person who's like, actually saved or whatever. And so that's where you have these big altar calls with all these rededications and these recommitments, and I'm going to get things right. I'm going to start serving in church. I'm going to do all this. And so it really, I guess the point I was getting to is there's an analogy in scripture that the irony is that notice that the weaker brother in scripture, Romans 14 and places like that, that the strong brother, it's interesting that it's always the weaker brother who has more rules, more standards, more behaviors, more concern about whether or not you should eat the meat offered to idols, or whether or not you should go and celebrate certain religious days and rituals. So the irony is that it's almost like the person who just has, and this, obviously it sounds so simple, but making that distinction between conversion and salvation, the person who is truly saved is probably going to express deeper understanding and deeper gratitude of the grace of God versus just how much more can I do. Now, on the flip side of that, I think there's definitely examples in scripture where we see that the weaker brother who has more standards and more rules, he may be weak, but he's still a brother, at least in terms of the way Paul looked at him, right? So it's like, you've got people who are coming out of that. But that's what's interesting is, especially in the context they were talking to, which was, basically mostly coming out of one religion to another, rather than atheism, Christianity. But it's the person who was like just barely out, the person who's just barely out of their religious stronghold is the weak brother. The person who is just barely out of this environment where behavior was the main core thing, right? The person who's just barely out of there is a brother, but the weaker brother, and the stronger brother is the one who understands grace. And so what this really does, what I think this ought to do is, well, number one, it scares the fire out of me. And I guess I don't want to say necessarily for myself, but for so many of the people that I love and have grown up with and been in those contexts with, because it's like now there's this really blurry line between being a super weak brother and even being a Christian at all, because you're so concerned with behavior. And if it's behavior that's tied to conversion, and there's a distinction between conversion and salvation, then there are a whole lot of people right now who look and claim Christianity and are one day going to be told, I never knew you.
Well, and that's the dangerous of, if I were a Christian viewer of this particular show, and I was hearing all of this, I could easily see some Christians hearing this and so then sort of going into the, well, how do I know that I'm really saved? Am I just behave? It's a very frightening thing to say that, my behavior definitely show that I'm saved by God. But again, from a Christian point of view, salvation is of God. And so, everything that happens to me as a Christian and happens in the church ultimately is entirely an action or responsibility of God. The reason that we value salvation so highly is that we did nothing. It depends nothing on me. It's completely an act of God, and therefore the praise goes to God, not to me. I just become a illustration of God's character through my experience. And so it's dangerous to look to yourself for evidence that you're saved, because, salvation is not of you. So
yes,
there's that.
That's a good point.
Go ahead.
No, yeah. This really puts it. I think this has become a really thorough conversation that touches on points from every side of things, because you've all raised points that come at this from different angles. And I don't think I grew up in a situation even where, I would go to church and people would say, well, if you haven't had this conversion experience, you're not really saved. And so this just puts a whole new light that is both terrifying in one thought process and both absolutely edifying in the other, that's not what it's about. It's not about a conversion experience. It's about a salvation process. And that for me is both terrifying, because I know I haven't lived up to what I could have, but it's also extremely edifying, because it's like I can look over the history of my life and see that process playing out. That is an awesome thing.
Yeah. And you were talking about the theology. That is something that this drove home to me, is that salvation is a process versus a single moment where you go from not saved to saved. And you see this in process conversion. I'm almost at the point where we talked last time about crisis conversion, meaning this sort of bolt of lightning, come to Jesus moment, an instant experience where you suddenly are a Christian. And it almost seems to me like that's a myth. That process conversion in reality is how conversion actually occurs. Now, there is one moment in a lot of these models of process conversion, there's sort of a moment encounters a precept or something, the religion begins to start making sense to them. Everything lines up, and their experience up to this point starts to be consistent with the message of the religion. And so you could almost take one of these stages of the process model and call that the moment, the come to Jesus moment. There's also a moment of profession. When I say profession, I mean something openly. So for instance, Muslims say the Shahada, and they have to say it in the presence of other Muslims, and that's sort of their moment of profession. In the church, you do baptism, which is a public thing where you're publicly professing your belief, things like that. Now, this reminded me of what I wanted to talk about before, which was the testimony. Conversion researchers will frequently say that, how that you can recite sort of the story that you can tell multiple times, and it's fairly consistent, talking about your journey to becoming religious, to becoming a Christian or whatever other religion, is sort of the final stage, because at that point you've formed a narrative in your mind that explains who you are. Your identity is condensed into a narrative that you can recite, and that's your test. Give that in church, and everybody sort of applauds. And this idea of having a testimony is reinforced by the community. So you have and the testimony. It's interesting because what you do with the testimony is you sort of look back across your life and start to reinterpret all of your experiences as sort of a journey up to becoming a Christian. And you can start to see it in a providential way, where it's the hand of providence that into that situation, step by step up to the moment of becoming a Christian. So with deconversion, you have a very similar thing. You have atheists will give their testimony, or exit-mony, if you will. And this is the moment at which they look back across their Christian life, and they have to reinterpret all of the beliefs and experiences that they had then, which are very different from the beliefs now. And so you need to explain the inconsistency. And so they have to reinterpret all of those beliefs and experiences in light of atheism. And so, again, it's this sort of rewriting of your personal history to be consistent with your current views. And the way I explain it is like the end of the movie, The Usual Suspects. Anybody ever watch that movie? It's R-rated, typical church, then you probably haven't seen it. But the main character, the main actor in that used to be an atheist and became a Christian. So Stephen Baldwin, I think. Anyway, one of the Baldwin brothers.
Yeah, I think Stephen Baldwin's the one that became a Christian.
Yeah,
and I think I have a faith-based movie with him in it.
Yeah, and he wrote a book about his journey. He wrote his testimony in a book called The Unusual Suspects. So if you're interested in finding out that story. Anyway.
I tried watching The Usual Suspects. I only got about halfway through it, and then I had to just turn it off because it just wasn't, I just couldn't get invested in the story.
Well, I'm about to spoil it then for you then. But
all right, so I'll know how it ends.
Sure. So the entire movie, the narrator's a guy who's telling the story. And so, at the beginning of the movie, this police detective rounds up all these criminals and, starts sitting down and interviewing them. And one of them tells him the story of how these criminals all got together and, their various misadventures leading up to the moment of their arrest. And so that's the movie. It's all these flashbacks being told by this criminal to the detective. And then at the end of the criminal finishes his story and the detective lets him go and he's wandering out. And then the detective starts to glance around the room and begins to see clues to show him that the entire story he heard was a lie, that this criminal had just sort of made the whole story up. And then he starts putting the pieces together and realizes, the actual story behind the story. And so there's this moment, it's very well done in where he comes to sort of deconstruct the story he's been told and sort of put it together again in what it actually was. And it's a good analogy for this deconstruction and this sort of testimony that's put back, where you reconstruct what you thought was your history into what it is now. So it's this kind of aha moment. And so this narrative restructuring is true.
You're cutting out just a little bit, honest, Joe. The narrative restructuring is what?
It's the same with both converts and deconverts. You have to write your life story in light of your current beliefs.
Makes sense.
And that's all I wanted to say about that.
Mm-hmm. That's all I have to say about that.
Yep, pretty much.
Fair enough. I don't know where Steve went. maybe he didn't want to have the ending of The Usual Suspects spoiled for him.
Maybe.
Probably.
I suspect.
Yeah, I
and
mean,
look,
the ending. Oh, there
he's
he comes.
back. He really just
Yay.
didn't want to have the ending spoiled for him. So, he timed that perfect. So that was.
Steve, I finished telling the movie.
Sorry, I had a internet problem again. Sorry.
Yeah, that never happens to me. What's that like?
I'm surprised we haven't lost you yet tonight, Joe.
So,
yeah.
Did you guys want to revisit and start talking about the modal typical church? Because that's my menu of things to talk about. If not, if we've more or less covered that ground, we can start to round it out.
I mean, yeah. So, if you can, hopefully you can hear me. You guys out a little bit. If you can't hear me, somebody pop it in the chat or something. Yeah, I don't know necessarily what to say the modal typical church, other than the fact that it seems to me to be one of the best. I mean, features in your research is if you come from this kind of are maybe not more likely, but you certainly seem to be a prime candidate, right, for going through this deconversion process. And what's really interesting about it is, like, I mean, there are pieces of what you described on in the modal typical church that it's like some of them are half true. Like if you go back to your setting conditions, different things like textualism. Okay, well, there is a degree to which it is true that the Bible is our final authority for faith and practice, and degree of, okay, like there's biblical truth that needs to be there in order for other things that we believe to hold up. Another thing is like kind of like what Clinton said, we don't want to devolve into the thinking that there's nothing happening in the spiritual world, but at the same time we don't want to get in also into the thinking that everything that happens is a result of something that happens in the spiritual world. If a rat walks into my pantry and eats crackers, it's not because there was an angel and a demon warring in my kitchen last night. It's rat pantry. So,
We're getting some really bad interference here.
Separation.
We
The Bible.
lost you at the rat in the pantry.
Out from the world of everybody, then you find these. So, are in the
Either Steve's cutting out or I am.
Okay, yeah, no, I think it's Steve, because I can hear you okay. Steve's cutting out pretty bad right now. Yep, and he froze up again. He's going to disappear shortly. I feel bad whenever I see somebody freeze up.
Well, it's not your fault.
No,
so
it's our service here. Or
let me do this. I'd like to look at the modes that we associate with modal typical churches, because I think, again, if we can adjust these, then we're adjusting the environment out of which you see deconverts emerge. And so if we can sort of adjust, able to reduce the level of deconversion that we see, and the reason, one of the main things reported by deconverts as a result of their deconversion is a sense of freedom, of relief. And so you see this, for instance, in the bus campaign that they did in Canada, I think, where it said that they're proud, so relax and enjoy life. It's this idea that religion is a heavy burden and it puts a lot of stress on my life, and that it's something that I really enjoy getting free of. So the church becomes an aversive environment, and I'm trying to escape that environment. And so if we can somehow adjust the environment to be less aversive, we might significantly reduce this the exiting of individuals from the church.
I'm kind of jumping back into the conversation now. I've kind of been in and out. I'm terribly sorry. I'm guessing. From what you just said, maybe you addressed some of what I said. So maybe you heard some of it. I don't know. For all I know, I was talking to myself. So I was talking about the setting conditions. Is that what you just got done answering? Was basically problematic setting conditions?
I missed most of what you said. Now, the gist of what you said, I think, was that you can't dismiss some of these setting conditions because they're important parts of Christian belief. So, for instance, you said textualism. You can't just toss Scripture out just because textualism tends to be a problem. Spiritualism, you can't eliminate the spiritual world just because problem, that kind of thing. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of the things I think that you mentioned last time, you came up with this terminology of the modal typical church, in the hopes of avoiding the connotations maybe that come along with the word fundamentalism. But I think we kind of all realize the big white elephant in the room, that if you're in a theology Facebook group, the word that people are going to throw around that's going to describe kind of what you're talking about is probably fundamentalism, kind of environment, I think, is what's going to end up happening. And it is interesting that what you see in these deconversions, so many times they come from this background. I mean, it's just like, you hear these things that many of us can identify from our past being the kind of things. And it's all of these things, the isolationism, the spiritualism, the textualism, taken kind of to the nth degree. And that, if these setting conditions really are one of the primary factors, then maybe even the primary factor or the primary commonality you see between all of them, then there's definitely something there. There's work for the apologist and the theologian, plenty of ground to till there for sure.
So, I think that the issue boils down to sort of a freedom of thought. And if you can allow for freedom of thought within the church, then you've eliminated a lot of these problems right off the bat. And so, again, this is the idea that it's okay to disagree with me theologically and still be brothers in Christ, and it's one of the things that we as apologists enjoy is, listening to, comfortable to listen to debates. We can hear both sides of the issue and, get the strongest, the steel man of each side versus, one person standing up and say that, mid-trib rapturists will say this, but they're wrong because this, you're only getting one person's view of that. And there's very likely a straw man being represented in that. And so the fact that we can hear both sides of an issue and we don't judge one of the sides as being evil because they're wrong, and that's okay. And so if we allow within a church the idea that it's okay to be wrong about something, because we all are, we're limited in our knowledge and our understanding, and consequently, to some degree, every one of us is wrong about something. And so that's intellectual humility right there. And then to permit Christians to say I don't know and be comfortable with the fact that, yes, I don't know. There are some things where the I don't know is the correct answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to carry us, especially with the time. I mean, I'm fine, but like for everybody else, like I don't want to carry us in an unhelpful direction. But based on what this research is and the title of these things, like, do we need to discuss to anyone else's satisfaction more so kind of the biblical theological stuff about what this means in terms of eternal security? Just to, if I were to summarize, if I were just to give my top 3 takeaways of, the marketing guy in me wants to say, the top 3 takeaways of the most extensive deconversion study ever conducted, the exclusive interview. My top 3 takeaways would be setting conditions, salvation versus conversion, the distinction versus those two, and crisis versus process. Salvation. I think that if it's true that the crisis conversion thing is actually a myth, like if that's true, that has profound implications for the way most of Western Christianity is handled and talked about and all of that. So I just kind of wonder, like, based on those takeaways, which I think everybody here would probably agree, those are 3 like huge things I think that came from this study. The setting conditions, which all of us kind of had an inkling of, but now there's definitely a pattern that we can easily see there thanks to your work. The setting conditions, understanding salvation versus conversion, and then crisis versus process salvation. Is there any need even because those kind of change? I mean, those, if you really grasp those things, they give you kind of a paradigmatic level of change in the way you think about salvation. And it starts to make you wonder whether or not you're even asking the right question anymore. But, you've got people who are going to discuss Hebrews 6 and, all of that stuff. And they're going to, in 1 John 2:19, where we started out, and they're going to want to kind of know, well, what is it? Is somebody once saved, always saved, or whatever? Do we need to, I don't know, each express our opinion on those things? Or, I don't know if that's the goal here or not.
Well, 2 things that I'll say. First of all, I like that you brought up the process thing, because the primary I have never read any of the research about crisis conversion where they don't mention Paul on the road to Damascus. This is held up as the standard when talking about crisis conversion. This is the poster child, if you will, of crisis conversion.
Yes.
And so the interesting thing is that, if you continue to read that story, Christ has a Christian come along and help Paul. And then that Christian brings him into his house and ministers to Paul and starts explaining the gospel to Paul. So in a sense, the conversion of Paul didn't necessarily happen at that moment on that road. There was a process. It was a process conversion, if you read the whole story. So again,
that's only perpetuated by, the myth of his name being changed, right? Because then you've got, once you think that, then you think, oh, okay, well, this is kind of this recreation happening in this moment. And there's like 3 layers of myth going on here with that story.
Yeah. So there's that. And I'm trying to remember. Oh yeah, here we go. When you get heavily into the world of behavior analysis, there is a free will that comes up, and I've read now, Caleb will know who I'm talking about, B.F. Skinner. This is part of Skinner. This is part of the coursework.
Sorry, as I said,
coursework that I've had to do. And Skinner was the creator and definitely master of behavior analysis. And I say that because, he died 50 years, 80s. So, 30 years ago now. And his work is still considered the standard. Very little change has been made to the field since he died. So he definitely did all the work in creating and perpetuating behavior analysis. And in addition to being a really good scientist and inventor, he was also a pretty decent philosopher. And so when you really digs into, what does it mean that we're biological organisms that can be shaped and molded by our environment and experiences? And he has to come away with the idea that, there is some reduction in the idea of free will. It's kind of inescapable from the perspective of a behavior analyst. But I think that Scripture kind of gives us an out when it comes to that, because but you'll have to correct me there, Steve. One of the books that Paul writes, the entire book almost is this sort of dichotomy he's making between body and spirit, or flesh and spirit. We do not feed the flesh, we feed the spirit. We don't follow the flesh, we follow the spirit. That kind of thing. Do you know which book I'm talking about? Your mic is muted there, Steve.
The irony is that I was just saying at 12:28 a.m. my time, my brain is not working as well as it could be, which is obvious by the fact that my mic was unmuted. I know. At this moment, all I remember about Galatians is that he's dealing heavily with the Judaizers there. So I'm not sure if I don't remember if that was specifically where he talks a lot about that. I can't remember.
All right. Well, I take my word for it. In some point in Scripture, Paul talks about that. The reason that I bring it up is because
there's a lot of that in the Corinthians. Okay. Maybe that's where it is. Like that which is flesh is flesh, that which is spirit is spirit. Right. Corinthians.
That's the one I'm talking about. Thank you.
Okay.
Anyway, so the reason I bring that up is because we can see a distinction between our biological behavior versus our spiritual behavior, and the things that drive the two of those. And here's a good example of what I mean. I always now, if you look at mammals, about 20% of mammals mate for life. Every other mammal out there just kind of, mates situationally with whatever happens to be the most beneficial mating of the time period. And it's interesting that humans, being mammals, don't have a consistent pattern when it comes to mating. If you were to take us purely behaviorally, not the kind of animal that mates for life. And yet, for some reason, sometimes we do. And so, if you look at marriage as an example of the spirit versus the flesh, a married man makes a commitment to his wife and then is often tempted to betray that commitment. And so if I was following a purely biological model, then my behaviors would reflect my biology to mate with everything that I see that has boobs. And then there's something about fidelity and commitment and loyalty that compels me to stay loyal to my wife. And so there's this constant struggle, as described in Corinthians, of the spirit against the flesh. And so if taken in that direction, you can show how beings have a type of behavior which is biological in nature and another type of behavior which is not biological in nature, and how the two tend to run into conflicts with one another, as probably perfectly demonstrated in the marriage situation.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm still trying to process it. Yeah, that's good.
Another good point.
Can you maybe bring that back around? I'm for some reason my brain here, I'm having trouble connecting that we do behavioral things that are not biologically driven. I'm having trouble connecting that back to the present discussion for some reason.
Okay. So when I look at deconversion in terms, behavior is completely controlled by one's history. Now, history includes things like your biological history, which means your nature, your genetics, that kind of thing. It's partially involves your cultural context, And in that way, it's most similar to what I've described as behavior control in the church. Your environment controls your behavior because of that environment. You behave in a way that's consistent with that cultural context, and therefore you become a controller of the behaviors around you, just as the behaviors around you control you. So that's what cultural context means. And then everything else is just your experiences. So, I mean, they talk about atheists being the kinds of people who don't have a consistent or a good father relationship. If that's the case, then this of absence of fatherhood or abuse would be conducive to their atheism. It would be a contributing factor, environmental factor that contributes to their behavior as an atheist. And so, viewed through the lens of behaviorism, it can be, it seems very consistent that when a church environment becomes aversive, meaning uncomfortable, that the individual will tend to seek an environment which is then the church. And so, from a behavioral standpoint, when your current environment is uncomfortable for you, you try to migrate to an environment which is comfortable for you. And, you see the same thing in conversion. I discussed this last time about the conversion model. Part of conversion is that you become a seeker, meaning that you're looking for some solution to an uncomfortable situation in your life. So again, this is you attempting to migrate to a more comfortable environment. And of what you see in the deconversion is environmentally contextualized for various reasons. So that's why my model of deconversion, follows a very behavioral pathway from the viewpoint of behavior analysis.
So then, were they ever really saved at all? That's what I want to know.
It's interesting that if I'm approaching it from that viewpoint as a behavior analyst, that this would be fairly friendly to an atheist point of view, right? Because I'm basically defining human behavior in terms of experience and environment, and less because of free will. And that seems like a position that would be kind of comfortable to an atheist. But what's interesting to me is I believe it was the first atheist show that I was interviewed on, when I got finished talking about it from the view, they were like, yeah, but what about the feelings and the experience of the person? Isn't there a therapeutic kind of approach that would be beneficial to the person? And that's not unusual, simply because the deconversion process is an extremely uncomfortable and in certain cases traumatic process. So as an atheist who's had experience in that direction, you've got a kind of lingering uncomfortable feelings or traumatic experiences that you would want addressed much more therapeutically than from sort of a cold rationalism of behavior analysis.
Yeah. So, interesting. So, I mean, in a sense, it's kind of like, the theologically minded Christian is just dying to know or dying to ponder or whatever, whether or not this person was saved. And the atheist finds that question to be so cold because they're interpreting their belief as being grounded, possibly, I don't know if that's the right word, but I'm going to use it, grounded in their behavior and in their experience. And so it's almost kind of like when the Christian asking the theological question says something like, oh, that means you were never really Christian at all. I guess the level of offendedness all really stems from this false belief that their behavior and their experience was kind of, I guess, equal to their level of belief or commitment, something of that nature. Would that be fair to say, you think?
Honestly, if I'm going to, address it, I would think that what you're seeing is something that we're seeing in the culture in general, that you don't question my narrative, that my experiences are my experiences and my feelings are my feelings, and they're legitimate to me, those things. And if I felt very uncomfortable, if religion has traumatized me in some way, shape, or form, this speaks to the evils of religion. And my trauma needs to be taken seriously and needs to be treated in such a way that it is respected and beneficial to me. So all of those things are, come from sort of a 21st century postmodern mindset, and sort of something you see generally in the cults from a sort of cold rationalism of behaviorism. This is not the scientific approach. This is more of the intuitive approach.
So that strikes me as interesting, and I think it's probably true, but really interesting as an apologist, because so often the apologist is concerned with the question, is that true? Well, you know what I mean? Like, is that false? Is that true? And this is kind of one of those things that's every now and then you hear, Bill Craig, he kind of gets frustrated from time to time because people really wonder about whether or not there's concern about whether or not things are objectively true. And he goes to these college campuses and stuff, and he kind of reports that no, people really do care whether or not these things are true, like legitimately, actually, objectively true. And so it's just really interesting to see this kind of thing popping up in these deconversion experiences, because these people who've supposedly come all the way out and made it to the other side, their reactions seem in a way less concerned. Maybe it's just two different things, I don't know, but they in a way seem less concerned with whether or not the thing they believed in was true, but they seem more concerned with their experience, their behavior, their things of that nature. And so as an apologist, the question comes up, well, how am I supposed to deal with these people? I want to know whether or not something is true, and these people seem less concerned with that. I mean, definitely it's there. Like in Steingart, I think Steingart's had some great conversations, like with Sean McDowell and stuff, and they talked about some of the stuff, and there definitely is that it gets to that point of whether or not you can actually believe this or whatever, but not before you wade through a bunch of talking about anecdotal behaviors and experiences, and the reasons definitely for belief that are given lean more towards those things than objective truth. So that just raises kind of the question in my mind of how does the apologist respond to such a person? Seems to me that if the apologist responds to this person with the sort of cold rationalism that they want the least in that moment, then we're not being very, whether or not it's right of them to demand us to treat them this way. I guess that's the question. Like, do we change our approach? Do we just do our cold rationalistic thing anyway? And let them be deconverts and let us be apologists? I think that's an interesting question.
All right. So there's a couple of things that, come to mind as you're talking about that. The one is that you were talking about evidence. To an extent, that experience is evidence, that my experience is valid because, I'm aware of what happened to me, and you can't, judge that experience as invalid. And you see the exact same thing happening on the Christian side, because for time immemorial, the strongest evidence for the truth of Christianity would be my testimony. Again, we talked about developing a testimony of your conversion. And then what do? You give, and this was the method of evangelism that, has been proliferated throughout Christian experience, is that, hey, when you come up to a person and you want to evangelize them, give your testimony, make it real to them. And that's your experience. And the same thing's true of deconversion. If frequently, if you listen to debates with atheists, frequently what the atheists and give their deconversion testimony. They'll say, this is my experience, this is what happened to me, and this is why Christianity is wrong, because my experience suggests that it's wrong. Again, this idea that experience is evidence. And then again, the atheist will turn back around and say that personal experience is anecdotal and is not evidence. So it really kind of depends on what they're talking, what they had for breakfast, as to whether personal experience is evidence or not.
Yeah, that's good. And I think, what's what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, right? I mean, a lot of times we want to definitely want to appeal to experience as well. And some really want to appeal to experience. It depends on your context. So that's fair. Yeah. I think there has to be a conscious awareness. If nothing else, maybe that is the takeaway. Maybe that alone is the takeaway from the research in terms of how to react to these people, is a conscious awareness of the fact that they consider their experience and their behavior to be some of the strongest evidence that they have. And so to be mindful of that as we attempt to approach them somewhat pastorally, rather than just rationalistically.
Yeah, so it's been my mission or goal at this point to do the research, come up with the findings and data, make it as accurate to real life as possible without putting a spin on it based on my particular viewpoints, and then report that data to the apologist community. And I think you've seen me doing, and then allow the apologist community to make out of that data what they will. And so this is one of the reasons that we wanted you to come on, because you're representing the theologian among us, and I'm reporting the data, and you're helping to take that data and construct some kind of analysis or viewpoint that's consistent with apologetics or theology. So, I do have my ideas, but I haven't taken these data and shaped them into a theology or an apologetic as of yet. If I will ever do that remains to be seen. I'm kind of uncomfortable at this point doing that, though, because I want to remain as consistent a researcher as possible.
I think that's fair.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally fair. Well, then I'll add that piece, and I'll just, again, I want to think a lot more about this, especially as it relates to, some of these notes I've taken. I kind of think they are each, like, I've got kind of 4 main takeaways. It's evolved from 3 to 4. Okay, if I may, just from the discussion we've had here these couple times from the research, and I think that any one of these things could be taken as a pretty serious topic of biblical study. Really, any one of them. The first one would be setting conditions. I mean, it is obvious that is again, we'll just reiterate, a huge deal. The environment that the person grows up in is a huge deal, and there's no shortage of scriptural examples where you can see an environment, especially one that happens to be baked in legalism and baked in performance and baked in tradition. We have plenty of example from scripture on how to deal with those kind of things. Paul dealt with it. Christ dealt with it. Peter dealt with it. The biblical authors dealt with it. So there's a serious study in scripture that can be done, I think, to deal with how to react and how to respond to people who insist on creating environments that these setting conditions end up in. The other next one, rather, is salvation versus conversion, right? Understanding that from a behavioral standpoint, we may define conversion as something different than salvation. And so the question is, what does that look like, biblically? Were the people in Hebrews 6, were they saved? Were they converted? Or were they neither? Right? So maybe these are some interesting, a little bit different way. It kind of creates a third category. Whereas the question, I'm just trying to make this dead on practical. If so forgive me if that's not working, but like a lot of people are just going to want to know. You start talking about this, and it's like, well, what about the people in Hebrews 6? Are they just warning passages? Could this happen? But maybe nobody ever did actually, or were these just talking about, Jews, whatever? Like, there are so many things that you could go into there, but adding the distinction between salvation and conversion allows that question to be asked a little bit differently. So I think that's a study. You could come to scripture with the knowledge. And I believe behavioral science, all kinds of science, is a gift from God. I believe being able to understand and analyze the human psyche to some degree is a gift from God. It's part of God's natural revelation. We shouldn't ignore it. So if it does seem like we can create this distinction between conversion and salvation in the real world, then maybe there's a way to explore that biblically. So that would be the second thing. Third thing would be crisis versus process salvation. It's obvious there's a really good study there to go into, because the poster child for crisis conversion, the Apostle Paul, you basically have debunked in this here very podcast episode, or YouTube video, whatever it is, the notion that this was a crisis conversion. It's obvious that this was a process, and even a process that started way back in the beginning with Paul's teaching under Gamaliel, and even before that, his first introduction into Judaism. Like this was an introduction to the biblical God, and his salvation is very much a realization of who the biblical God really is. So that his whole life, that we know of, that we're told about, was a conversion experience, not just Damascus Road. So there's a huge biblical study that could be done there. And then the final piece, which we just added here on the home stretch, was I wrote it down like this: a pastoral approach to belief and experience, which isn't the best way of wording it, but I think you get what I'm saying. Basically, understanding that people who leave are very heavily biased towards their own belief, or their own behavior. That's maybe what I should have wrote: behavior and experience. Pastoral approach to behavior and experience. Those people who are a product, or who leave, who end up deconverting, place a strong and very heavy emphasis on their own behavior and their own experience as evidence for the belief in God. And so, whereas we may want to look at it and say, no, it has everything to do with where your loyalty is, who you believe, whether or not you can clearly articulate the gospel, your need for a savior. For them, it's kind of all about belief and experience, or behavior and experience. So how do we take a pastoral approach to those people? And that kind of wraps it all back around to setting conditions. It seems to me like these setting conditions are producing this belief that behavior and experience are evidence, or are the best evidence. They might be some kind of evidence, but are the best evidence a person can have for their experience of God and their experience of salvation. And so it all kind of circles back around to the loop. So I would say those four things last time: setting conditions, salvation versus conversion, crisis versus process salvation, and then taking a pastoral approach to the whole behavior and experience thing. Does all of that sound fair? Did I flub up anywhere? I mean, this is important stuff. I mean, I think there are some serious areas for biblical study and research here, just in those four things.
Yeah, and I'd love to see the results of that kind of study that happens, because obviously it means that my research bore fruit, and everything you say makes sense to me, and I really appreciate it out, because you've done exactly what I wanted you to do. You've taken my data and applied them in a way that I hadn't.
Beautiful. Awesome.
And, I would agree with that. I think from a perspective of trying to take this and look at it from how do we apply this to apologetics, to the Christian life, I think you've done a good job putting that in a package that gives people next steps to take, which, when you listen to something like this, a lot of times you're left with just, okay, well, that's great. I know that now, but what does this mean? There are next steps. And I think you've given listeners that. If they can't take it from how you've kind of summarized this, then they probably need to go back and start over.
Yeah. Beautiful. Awesome.
Go us.
All right.
Yes.
We are almost at 6 hours, 5.5 hours, I think we're coming up on for this whole discussion. So, that's pretty extensive, but I think it's been important. And, honestly, I was a little surprised by some of the real meat of this discussion that came here at the end of it. It really did surprise me.
Yeah, let me just kind of add something here. Oh boy, this is a tangent, but we won't go down it that long. But there is this mindset, and it comes up in different things. And let me just say one thing: you will discover anew all the people that hold this kind of thinking when you become a Michael Heiser fan. Okay. So let me just caveat that. You become a Michael Heiser fan, you'll find out real quick who your friends are, who your enemies are, who your, just anyway. And so there is this mindset that I've heard, and there are particular circles in which you hear this kind of mindset that in one sense I want to agree with them, and in another sense it's the most dangerous thing I've ever heard of. And what the mindset says vaguely is, if they haven't come up with it in 2,000 years of church history and it's new, it's probably heresy, or it's probably not true, or it's probably whatever. Now look, I'm not, understand, I'm not talking about creating doctrine here, right? Nobody in this chat is trying to create new doctrine. When we have flashed the cult sign across the screen a couple times, it's not because we're starting one here today. Okay. It's because, of people where this has erroneously been done. But as we're given new tools by God, by the way, the Bible talks about a new heaven and a new earth. It's going to be new, made new, but we're going to be on earth for a while. Like, we are just in the beginning of this thing, in terms of learning about who God is. And yes, the Bible, I believe, is a closed canon. It's a closed revelation. God's not revealing anything new. That's not what I'm talking about. But as we're given new tools to learn about humanity, we discover interesting things like this. And there are questions that rage on for centuries, like, is it once saved, always saved? Can you apostatize? Can you do whatever? Is it Calvinism? Is it Arminianism? And you have these kind of questions that people have been fighting back and forth about the biblical data for years and years and years on. And you have verses that seem to say one thing, and you have verses that seem to say another thing. And what I want to know is, for all these people who basically say, well, if they didn't figure it out in 2,000 years, then there's nothing there to figure out. What are we doing going and getting theology degrees and research theology degrees and writing papers and showing up at all these thinking conferences and spending hundreds of dollars on books and listening to hundreds of hours of YouTube videos and podcasts? What are we doing with all that stuff if we don't think there's anything new to learn? I mean, Chuck Missler put out enough content to teach 30,000 Ugandas 10 times over, all the biblical information they could possibly want. Like, that's one guy. Okay. And then start thinking about, guys like, agree with him or not, John MacArthur, who's been pumping out content across every platform he could since the 1970s. Like, if it was just about teaching the same ways and the same things to new audiences, it wouldn't make any sense that we keep doing this stuff. The point is that we're given tools by God to think about things and to discover new things about humanity. I mean, as far as I know, we just laid out 4 things based on this new research that has been done that would allow us to actually look at the Bible and ask some completely new questions about things we already believe. We're still talking about, in a sense, once saved, always saved. But it's like, does the Bible inform us now that we know that there is a behavioral element to this thing and there can be a distinction made between salvation and conversion? Now that we know that, can we come to the text with different questions than we had before and gain new insight into how these things work? One example of this, and then I'll shut up, I promise, for the rest of the night. Molinism. Okay, like this, and again, this is maybe not the best example because, Molina was from centuries ago to originally, come up with these ideas. But there are, monism is one of these things that we now have kind of new information from science, information from, again, some of the work that's been done in philosophy over the centuries to think about things like logical priority versus chronological priority, and these kind of things that we can think about that would allow us to place metaphysical time in the mind of God, figuratively counting down to creation, and whether or not God, knew about events that were going to happen before he created versus after he created. Like, we can think about these things so specifically now with new intellectual tools that we have. And from that came I believe to be a very fruitful development called Molinism, where I think, and again, I don't know where y'all stand on that. I am a Molinist. I personally, that's a big kind of, another rabbit hole. But so I think that Molinism very fruitfully solves the question of free will versus the sovereignty of God. That's my personal opinion. And I'm just like, that's a new tool that we have, a new way of thinking about things that we used to just have to kind of throw our hands up and say, oh, it's a mystery. We'll never have any idea how this works. Bless God, on this side of the door of heaven, it says whosoever will. On the other side of the door of heaven, it says chosen before the foundation of the world. We used to have to think in those terms. And now I think there's a way that we don't have to think in those terms. We can actually make sense of some of this stuff as we're becoming, in our own walks more like Christ, and we can think clearer, and we're given new tools as time progresses on to think about this. So maybe a more overarching takeaway, not from Joel's research, but just from research like this in general, start to open your mind. We're not talking about overturning Christian doctrine here, but we're talking about returning to the text with brand new questions that may help us discover, like, we're just three random guys talking at 1 o'clock in the morning, about this. Like, I mean, I'm not presenting this research at a conference, but maybe one day I will be, who knows? And it, maybe because of Joel's research, like if somebody actually takes and runs with this idea of crisis versus process salvation, and approaches the biblical text and starts answering those questions, maybe somebody comes up with the next Molinism to help us understand how we can teach evangelism and stuff to people, to instead of get that salvation, that conversion moment, and start adding names to the roll. Maybe we can make breakthroughs that help people see it as more of a process, and see it as more of, well, how can I guide people through this process better than just ask for this conversion? Maybe we've done it wrong. Maybe some of these things that we're asking questions about, we've done wrong for so long because we've been taught by our mamas and daddies that that's the way it was, and that their mamas and daddies taught them that that's the way it was, and etc. But they didn't have access to some of the intellectual tools that we have today. So I just want to kind of encourage people to not commit heresy. That's encouragement number one. Okay, understand there are limits to the kind of questions that you can ask, because there are very clear things in Scripture. But those things that aren't so clear, like, let's start asking new questions and opening our mind to think that maybe some of this stuff could be explored further.
All right, thank you. Well,
that's all I got.
I think it's about time to wrap it up. Sure, we can continue to talk all night, but
yeah, that was about as good of a summary and ending point I can think of. We could drag this out another 10 minutes, but I think that was a great ending point. So, Steve, give the 15-second version of where people can hear more from you.
Yep, steveschramm.com, spelled just like it looks right there in the name there, steveschramm.com.
And Joel, for more on your conversion and deconversion research studies?
The research is ongoing as I continue to think about this and read into other research about it and so forth. And I post my updates frequently on the Facebook page, Switching Sides. And, the Facebook page is the thing I update most often, because Twitter doesn't allow me to put a lot of words in there. And it's difficult to cite my sources when I've got to work with, what is it, like 700 characters?
Yeah, it's not
a Twitter account, and I try to tweet out as much as I can on this as well. It's switching. It's sides switching, at sides switching. I just recently did a video on where I analyzed a atheist video titled 7 Signs That You'll Be a Christian, an atheist one day. And I looked at those signs in light of my research, which I mentioned at the top of the show. So probably cut that out of it.
Yeah.
By the way, this is a 3-hour show. This is going to be a heck of an editing project.
No joke. I'm just going to take Steve's segment from like an hour ago, where he just summarizes things into 4 neat points. And, well, it was 3 points then. Now it's 4. Anyway, I'm just going to take that and make a 30-second version of this for people too. So,
all right, let's talk about the
this.
mentionables for a second.
Yeah.
You can follow the mentionables on our Twitter or website at thementionables.org. I'm going to repeat that, thementionables.org. Nothing else. Got to put the "the" there.
Don't go to that other. Yeah, no.
Yeah. And always follow our Facebook page, which is updated quite regularly as well. And oh yeah, Patreon. If you become a Patreon subscriber, we've got another series of podcasts going on in there. A lot of them based on debates from the mentionables, and we, depending on which tier you join, you can be part of our Book of the Month club. We're going to be sending out some C.S. Lewis books pretty soon, and it also supports us and my research.
Yeah, and don't forget, while you're here, this probably on YouTube right now, go ahead, hit the notification bell, hit the subscribe button if you're new to the channel. Hope you'll come back and check out some more of our content. Not all of it's 3 hours long, but if you hung around through this entire episode, go ahead and comment and chat, because that deserves some kind of medal or one of the little plastic trophies from Dollar Tree or something. So thanks for staying with us. And that's it. Good night.
And keep on mentioning.